Look, the most terrible deeds that are being done in this world today are all done in the name of God.
From Portland, Oregon, Verdict Publications presents its 1987 Summer Seminar, Farewell to Religion, with Verdict editor Robert D. Brinsmead. An Australian entrepreneur, Mr. Brinsmead has lectured extensively on 5 continents and is a lay theologian. In this session, he speaks on the resurrection as the new creation.
The resurrection was the new event which made everything new. It certainly made everything new for those first Christians. It gave them a new vantage point, a new perspective. They saw everything as new. The resurrection will do the same for us today. When the New Testament wants to describe the reality of the resurrection, it uses a number of images drawn from the Old Testament. And one of the great images drawn from the Old Testament is that of creation. The New Testament borrows the creation imagery from the old story of creation found in the Old Testament. Jesus is seen as the new Adam, the man in God's image, the realization of human destiny, who makes all things new. Paul speaks of the new creation as in terms of the old is past and the new has arrived. Behold, I make all things new. In fact, from the perspective of the New Testament, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is not just the new creation which replaces the old. The resurrection really is the real beginning of human history. The resurrection is the real beginning of the history of the world. Unless we see that, we don't really grasp the startling newness of the revelation which came by the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And not only is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead the real beginning of human history, it is also the end, because in the resurrection, God realizes his destiny for humanity, and so the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is not only the beginning of history, it is also the end of history. And that is why the last book of the New Testament can speak of Christ saying that he is Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. So much so that all that comes before the resurrection of Jesus is likened all that comes before the creation in the story of Genesis 1, darkness and chaos. For instance, the author of the first gospel can write about what appeared to be the glorious Mosaic dispensation, and he calls it darkness. The darkness is past, he says, speaking about the Old Testament dispensation and the era of Moses and the law. The darkness is past and the true light now shines. So in the light of the resurrection of Jesus, the real beginning of human history, the real beginning of the world, the real creation, all else that precedes it is thrown in the shade. Indeed, by comparison, appears to be darkness and confusion. Now that certainly gives a new view of the Old Testament, and if you have any problems with the old creation stories and where they came from and the problems of modern science and many, many other things that are very, very difficult to handle for some Christians, if you stand in the light of the resurrection, it's not going to cause you any problems, because you say world history really begins here. This is the real beginning of world history. And I say again, all that precedes it. Even the glory of the Mosaic dispensation, all that precedes the resurrection is now so much thrown in the shades. That the apostles liken it to the darkness and to the chaos that's described in Genesis 1. This new beginning, which was the real beginning, gave those first Christians a new way of looking at everything. This is what Paul is writing about in one passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. If anyone be in Christ, that means to be in Christ is to stand in the light of the risen one. If anyone be in this faith and stands at this vantage point, he is a new creation. He has become a new creature. He has a whole new outlook. He has a vantage point in which he doesn't see everything from an ordinary human standard point of view. And that's what he's talking about in context, because he said it really means now to be a Christian is that we don't judge things from an ordinary human standpoint. We don't go evaluating things as if the resurrection hasn't taken place. Because now to stand in the light of the risen one means that because this is a new creation and everything has become new and we stand in it, therefore everything for us is now brand new. And we don't see anything anymore like we used to. The whole world is turned upside down and we see absolutely everything from a new standpoint. Let me give a few illustrations of how these first Christians saw everything from a new standpoint. They had followed Jesus with great and high hopes. But everything turned out, it seemed to be an unmitigating disaster. They had thought confidently that he was the Messiah, but the events that overtook them seemed to prove that he was a pretend Messiah. And they were a dime a dozen in those days. There were plenty of false messiahs that people were led astray by, and they concluded they must have been just another lot. And so the cross and the events surrounding it was to them an unmitigating disaster. Their cause was in shambles. Then came the resurrection. Did it change their view of the disaster? Well, that'd be an understatement, wouldn't it? Looking at Calvary from a human standpoint of view, what can you see? You can't see anything but blackness, despair, defeat. But in the light of the resurrection, that which was shame became glory, and Christ crucified was Christ glorified. It changed their total perspective about what had happened and the person of Jesus. And the enigma of his person was now understood in the revelatory light of the great event of the resurrection. Now, what we need to appreciate here, when we think of revelation, is God's apocalypse, God's revealing, God's great revelatory act. In itself, the great revelatory act does not take place in the life of Christ, in the teaching of Christ. These are not understood in and of themselves on their own terms, and the great revelatory event, the mighty disclosure, does not take place at the cross. nothing is understood until the resurrection. The resurrection is the great event of revelation. It is the disclosure. And standing in the light of the resurrection, they then see the cross, the life of Christ, the teaching of Christ, and everything that they've been through. Now they begin to understand. It gives them a new view of the past. The resurrection not only gave those first Christians a new view of the cross and the life of Christ and the teachings of Jesus, it gave them a new view of the Old Testament. Think of it. Didn't it give them a new way of reading the Old Testament? Now they read the Old Testament not as before, but as actually as a witness to the Christ. In fact, the Apostle Paul declares that the entire Old Testament, all the promises that God made to the fathers, recorded in the Old Testament, are fulfilled in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So the resurrection becomes the meaning of the Old Testament. And in the light of this event of revelation, they look at the entire Old Testament in a completely new light. This illustrates, if anyone be in Christ, that is, stand in the light of the risen one, he is caught up in this new creation. The old has passed. The old way of seeing, of evaluating, of judging things is completely turned upside down. Behold, everything becomes new. Think of this important aspect of the Old Testament called the law, which the Jewish people called the Torah. Sometimes it is the law of Moses. Sometimes it's even the law of God, because God gave it through Moses. Sometimes in its broad context, it is simply the entire Old Testament can be called the law, the Torah, the instruction. Or the law, the Torah, is the Jewish religion. Now, does the resurrection, or did the resurrection, give those first Christians a new way, a new view of the Torah, the law? It certainly did. In the light of the resurrection, they begin to comprehend that the Jewish religion, called the law, the Torah, is no longer binding. It is no longer to be seen as the way in the new age of the resurrection. Christ is the end of it, the New Testament says. Once Christ has come, you're no longer under the supervision of it. You can say goodbye to it. So the resurrection gives them a new view of what was called in their day, the Torah and its status. Before the resurrection, what status does the Torah have? Come on, what status does the Torah have for a Jew? Is there anything higher than it? No, the Torah is the supreme status. But in the light of the resurrection, Christ dethrones the Torah, and he is the one who has that status. Is that clear? Right? That's real clear from the Old Testament. But from the resurrection, I mean, not from the Old Testament. Right. Now, the interesting thing is this. Don't think that when the resurrection came and they had a new way of looking at Calvary, and they saw Calvary not as a disaster, but as a victory, and it turned everything upside down. They begin to see the Old Testament in a new light. Don't think just suddenly the resurrection comes and now everything in the New Testament is as clear as a pikestaff, that they can work out the implications of the resurrection overnight. Don't think they understand this about the new status of the law all of a sudden. Finally, the leaders of the church at Jerusalem, which included the apostles, the first witnesses to Christ's resurrection, the leaders of the first Christians, that is the church at Jerusalem, come to the conclusion that the Torah, this was their first step, the Torah, the law, is not binding on Gentile believers. They came to the conclusion that the law is not binding on Gentile believers. Think about it. Do you know how long it took them to come to that conclusion? It took them about 17 years to get to that point. 17 years of reflecting on the resurrection before they tumbled to it that the Torah is not to be imposed upon Gentile believers. It was sufficient for them to believe the gospel. But if you think that's slow, how long do you think they tumbled to it that the law was not even binding on Jewish believers, that the Jews were free to go and join the Gentile believers and to live like them? How long do you think it took those Jerusalem Christians or those Jewish Christians to tumble to it that the Torah, the law, was no longer binding on them either? Because if it's not binding on one section of the church, how can you make it absolutely binding on the other? Or does God have two standards? Or two ways? The amazing thing is, it took those early Christians, including the leaders like James, more than 40 years to tumble to that second conclusion. And the terrible fact is, many Jewish Christians never tumbled to it and refused to accept it. You know, we get the idea from the perspective. I remember studying the history of Luther. And when I did the study in detail, it was quite a surprise to me to realise that Luther never came to the great insight that made the Reformation overnight. It was a great process. It was a long process, spread over many, many years. And we sort of have that vision of Luther sitting in the tower, you know, contemplating in the tower, and suddenly the light comes to him, the just shall live by faith, and there it is, the complete picture of the Reformation. History actually sort of overturned my view, because further research showed that Luther never got the insight in the tower. In close study of the German language, they found that he got his insight on the toilet, and that seemed to spoil the story a bit. That's true. He suffered from constipation, and he spent a lot of time, profitably it seems, on the toilet. And the Catholics rather laughed when they found out that the beautiful story of Luther contemplating in the upper room, you see, getting the light from heaven, was actually received in the toilet. But, you know, history sometimes, you know, strips away the myths. And so here are these great first apostles. They were the ones who witnessed the resurrection. And we get the idea, because they were the first witnesses, naturally they knew more about the meaning of the... Don't we assume that? What Christians don't assume, let me ask you, what Christians, what in our tradition, what Christians don't naturally assume saying the men who saw the resurrection are the most authoritative as to what the resurrection means? It's absolute nonsense. If that was so, we must reconstruct history, and now we know it wasn't the apostles who were the first witness to the resurrection, who tumbled to the meaning that the law was no longer binding on the Gentiles or even the Jewish believers. Rather, it was a Hellenistic Christian, or that is a Greek-speaking Jewish Christian, such as Stephen and his friends, that saw the implication of the resurrection, meaning that the whole temple cult and the law of Moses was finished. So he saw that meaning before the apostles did. He was way ahead of them. So just to assume because the person is the first witness to the resurrection means that they understand it better than anyone else. That means they understand the implications of the resurrection because they saw it and we depend upon their witness. That's a false conclusion. You might as well tell me that Einstein, if you want to know what E equals mc squared mean, Einstein understands the implications of that better than anyone else could ever understand it because Einstein was the first to discover it. Now, is that a sensible conclusion? No, it's not sensible. Men today, even schoolboys, can know more about E equals mc squared than Albert Einstein. And now the implication of the resurrection. It makes everything new. You see everything in a new standpoint. It caused the first Christians to see the Torah, the law, at a new standpoint. Number one, it was not binding on Gentile believers. Number two, it was not even binding on Jewish believers, and Jewish believers could go and live as Gentiles. That's what Peter began to do up at Antioch. He began to eat and drink with the Gentiles. He began to live as a Gentile. That's what Paul said to him. If you are a Jew, now you are living after the manner of the Gentiles. You've done a big flip-flop, he said, and now you are forcing the Gentiles to live after the manner of the Jews. But you could see Peter was beginning to creep out of the holy city, wasn't he? You know, he was like old Noah getting his head out of the ark. And he began to take a first few gingerly steps. You know, maybe he tried eating pork chops or something. You know, that was a big... It was like Neil Armstrong's, one small step for Neil Armstrong, but one big step for mankind. Peter was taking one big step, even to eat. Think of it. Even to eat with Gentiles was one big step for Peter. And when those men from Jerusalem turned up, you know what happened to Peter? Back he went again. Took him a little while to creep out again after that one. But the resurrection gave that freedom, it gave that newness, it gave that new way of looking at the law. But don't think it came overnight or without a struggle. The first step, as I said, took 17 years. And the next one took more than 40 years. And it wasn't the apostles who witnessed the resurrection who led out in either step either. It was second and third generation Christians that went faster than the ones who were the first witnesses. And herein the words of Jesus were fulfilled. The first shall be last. And that happened. And the last to come in. They were the first. You see, the resurrection even turns that upside down about the supreme authority of the apostles in the sense of them knowing more about the implications of the resurrection than anyone else. That's not necessarily true, as history demonstrates. Now, if the resurrection faith gave those first Christians a new view of the law, it had to give them a whole new view of sin. Why? Because in the old era, how was sin defined? Oh, quite simply. There's the holy city, there's this fence called the Torah, all those who live within it, all those who faithfully keep the Torah, they are the righteous, and all those outside, the Galileans, the tax gatherers, those people that Christ often associated with, they were clearly outside, and of course the Gentiles, they were clear outside. The Samaritans, the Romans, the Syro-Phoenician woman, all those people were clear outside, and they were sinners. So sinners was defined, sin was defined by how one stood in relation to the Jewish Torah. Correct? And all those in were the circumcised, that means they were the clean, and all those outside were the unclean. And there had to be a clear distinction made between the clean and the unclean, right? Illustrated by the clean and the unclean food. Those in ate clean food, those outside ate unclean food. And that had a very, very vital connection with the separation of unclean people from clean people. Those inside were clean people, those outside were clean people, and the clean people, that is the Torah-keeping people, were not even according to the law to eat with the unclean people, because eating in that culture meant fellowship together before God. It was a sort of a covenantal fellowship. So sin is defined by the Torah, by the law. And still we have the mentality in Christianity, of course, today, that's widespread, that sin is simply defined as if you break the rule, you're a sinner, if you keep the rule, you're not. But actually, when we look at Jesus and Paul, and especially as we see everything in the light of the resurrection, although Jesus starts to sort of unveil what he's getting at, but you don't really get the point until the resurrection, you see the resurrection turns everything upside down, and you'll have a whole new way of determining who the righteous, who just people are, and who unjust people are. It's no longer on the basis of how you relate to the Torah at all. It's now all on the basis of how you relate to the risen Christ. Now, Jesus illustrated that in his day. He said to the Syrophoenician woman, who was a poor pagan, he says, go in peace, you're saved by faith, your faith has saved you. Didn't ask her to make any confessions and sign any oaths or any such religious commitments, never had her religiously programmed into the Jewish way. Just she stood in the right relationship to Christ. Well, that's it. That's enough. Now, actually, in the light of the resurrection, in the light of Christ, all those outside the city, they are sinners. We admit that. And all those inside the city, they are sinners too. And Paul comes along and says there ain't any difference. That's what he said. There isn't any difference. Now, that's quite a scandalous thing to say. But both Jesus and make that Paul, the resurrection actually means there isn't any difference. Life is found only in the Son. Let me put it to you, run a little bit ahead here. This is what Paul found. He thought keeping the Torah was the way of life. He found in the light of the resurrection it was only the way of death, because when he confronted the living one on the Damascus road, he found life in a person and in fellowship with a person. He found spirit and life in the risen Christ. That was life. Now, if there's life only in the risen Christ, everything else is what? Everything else is the way of death, and that's what sin is. Sin is any way that doesn't give you life. If it doesn't lead to life, it's sin. If it's not in that vital relationship with the risen one, it's sin. Whatsoever is not of faith in this risen one becomes sin. Now, if we like, we can make the distinction when we say there's no difference between those sinners outside the city and these people inside carefully keeping the law. There is no difference. In a way, I could sort of make some differences in another sense. I mean, those outside, I mean, they are the revellers and the drunkards and the sexual deviant people, and they're obvious sinners. We can call them, I suppose, in a modern parlance, let's call them playboy sinners. You know, that's the sort of stuff they do, and that's the sort of literature they read. Now, those inside the city wouldn't think of doing things like that. They are moral and religious, no question about it. They are religious and moral and good people. Now, these are the pious sinners. You see, you have two classes of sinners in the world. You have the playboy sinners. They are the, out-and-out sinners. They make no pretense about anything. You've got the playboy sinners and the pious sinners. Now, apparently, Jesus is more at home with the first than with the second, and so was Paul, because he got after the second class more than he did with the first. In his letters, he's more angry, he gets more upset with the second class than he does with the first class, right? And the first class accept Jesus more readily than the second class. Well, why? Why does the resurrection begin to turn everything upside down and put everything in a new light? Because if you meet these playboy sinners and you say to them, tell me, why do you do what you do? They say, well, the devil made me do it. I mean, they might say it was my lust, my passions, or, my hereditary or something, but they're virtually giving the old cop-out. Here's the excuse of all playboy sinners. The devil made me do it. But, and here is the rub, if you meet the people in the city carefully doing the will of God, carefully living by the Bible, because that's what Torah is, it's only living by the Bible, and you say to them, why are you doing this? Do you know what their answer is? Their answer is, God made me do it. God made me do it. And that's why they're harder to reach. Because if a person is he's going the way of death, and it can't give him life, but if he's convinced that God made him do it, he's very hard to reach, because God is his master. Listen, isn't that true? The most terrible deeds that are being done in this world today are all done in the name of God, whether it's over there in Northern Ireland or whether it's over there on Iran. If you ask them, seeing, here is a person, a poor Baha'i faith, a person in the Baha'i faith, and it's happening. It's terrible. And they've been persecuting in an Iranian dungeon. They are being dreadfully tormented, persecuted. Now, if you confronted one of those persecutors and say, why are you so unmerciful? Why is there no compassion? What is making you do what you're doing to these poor Baha'i people? What do you think the persecutor would say? Do you think he'd say there and say, do you think his excuse would be, well, the devil made me do it? Not at all. It's God made me do it. He's a very religious person. He's carrying out his religion. But you see, the resurrection gives us a whole new view now of what sin is. The resurrection brings us life, the way of life. Life is found in the risen one. It's not found anywhere else. By faith we have life in the risen one. Anything else at all, be it ever so moral, be it ever so beautiful, whatever philosophy it is, it's all the way of death. And sin is simply anything that doesn't give you life. That's certainly a whole new way of looking at sin, which came, of course, in the revelation of Jesus and to the apostles. And so we could go on. The resurrection gave them a new way of looking at missions and looking at the world. Because the mighty revelatory, the mighty disclosure of God took place in the event when he raised up the crucified from the dead. This was the beginning, this was the real commencement of human history. For them. And gave them a new way of looking at everything. And above all, it gave them a new way of looking at Calvary. Now, instead of being a shameful disgrace, a scandal as it appears to be, this scandal is something that these Christians can glorify in, and Paul can glory in the cross. So it's the resurrection which glorifies Calvary for what it is, puts it in its true light. But here we're dealing with something very, very mysterious. It's very apparent from the New Testament that here, in the light of this resurrection faith, the first Christian community grows. They begin to see things from a new perspective, from a new standpoint. It doesn't come all at once. They make some progress, but the progress is made in the midst of great opposition, right, even from among themselves. Some are dragging their feet. Some cannot realize that this is the implication of the resurrection, and they can't take the next step, that this is the freedom which the community has now by virtue of the resurrection. So if we really look at the New Testament, what we see is both progression and regression. There are some who are not standing and consistent with the light. There are tendencies to look at things, to go back and to look at things from an ordinary human standpoint. And then, of course, after that age passes, then we have an acceleration of this great reversal until everything becomes inverted and turned around backwards. Now, it's not within the scope of our sort of seminar here to go into the details of church history and the ramifications and how it all came about, but let me suggest one point. Where this strange reversal takes place at the most plausible and subtle way, in the most subtle way. We have seen how that the resurrection is the revelatory disclosure of God that illuminates the meaning of everything else. Correct? You got the point? It illuminates the meaning of Calvary. It glorifies the meaning of the death of Christ, so that Christ crucified is now Christ glorified, that the Christians, instead of being scandalized by the terrible event, now see it is something to glory in. But a change of focus takes place in Christianity, whereby instead of starting with the resurrection and understanding the cross in the light of the resurrection, you have this reversal takes place of trying to understand, of starting with the cross and making this the starting point, the very central and starting point of the Christian faith, and then endeavouring to understand everything else in the light of the cross. Even to the point of trying to understand the resurrection in the light of the cross. And I want to show and impress upon our consciousness that this is the wrong way of doing everything. Because if we come now, like trying to come from the Old Testament, as if the Old Testament explains the meaning of the New Testament, would you accept that proposition? Of course it doesn't. Well, it's the same thing as if to say the cross explains the meaning of the resurrection. The reality of it is to begin anywhere else, but from the revelatory act of the resurrection is in fact to begin in darkness and confusion. Because if we think now we make the death of Christ the starting point and understand everything else, including the resurrection, from that starting point, since we don't have the meaning that the resurrection gives to Calvary, which is meaning, we don't now start with the meaning that God gives to Calvary. We must give to the cross our own meaning. Can you see that? We have to project some human meanings now into the meaning of the death of Christ, and from this grows up the whole Orthodox Christian religion of the death of Christ, the substitutionary theories of atonement, and what else you have. Which are really, when you think about it, are only a projection of human culture. In all these theories of the atonement, there's a governmental theory, and there's the Anselmian, based upon the model, it's based upon the model of feudal society. Then you have the Reformers, particularly Calvin. His view of the atonement is a projection of the criminal court and criminal jurisprudence to try and explain the atonement. And I could go on and look at the other views. What they all are is a projection of human culture, of human meanings. It is a projection of human meanings to this mighty event, instead of accepting the disclosure, the revelation given in the light of the resurrection. Now there's some terrible consequences of that. There are. Because when we start to think about human nature and all human history, there is this tendency in all men in particular. I'm not being exclusive to women, I want to vindicate them a bit. But in male, when I say men mostly, by the way, men in a generic sense, man in the generic sense really means male and female. Male is not full man, neither is female. Man is male and female. So when I talk about man strictly, I really mean both, right? But man has this terrible tendency to subordinate. One of the great evils of human nature is power, the will to dominate, the will to subjugate and exploit others. Subjugation and exploitation of others. And if you look at all the powers and institutions and so on, you see this great domineering, exploiting, subjugating, controlling and exploiting others. Religion is actually man's attempt to legitimise his institutions which dominate and tyrannise and oppress others. So what he does is project all those things. He projects this will to subjugate, this will to exploit others. This becomes largely projected to the God and Father of Jesus Christ in many of the theories of the atonement. And then that in turn, that human projection of God, what happens then? It legitimizes all the institutions and the ways of man to subjugate and to oppress others. It justifies the church's right to suppress and to subjugate others. And then there can be the model of Christ, the masochistic Christ, to be the model that the real happiness that comes is the happiness of submission and the happiness to be nothing and to be subjugated and to be exploited. So the very, very heart, the holies of the Christian religion becomes a tremendous power to reinforce the domineering power structures, to subject and to exploit the laity, on the clergy and the religious institutions, to subjugate and to exploit the laity, and for males to subject and to exploit women and to the disadvantage and so on. And then it becomes also the great impetus that they might gladly and happily and find their true joy in being subjugated and exploited. And religion, as all sociologists know, religion then becomes a tremendous power to reinforce the existing social structures in order to maintain the status quo. More about that later. But I want to suggest that the resurrection, to look at the cross in the light of the resurrection, in the light of the amazing disclosure that takes place there, turns the whole traditional Christian theology on its head. It makes everything new. You see, we must begin where the early church began, the first Christians began. We too must come into the light of this new creation. We must now begin to see that the real beginning of human history doesn't take place back there in the darkness of the Old Testament and speculations about the origin of Genesis and how it is written and the battles between the evolutionists and the creationists. Whether God took some mud and made man from mud, or whether he took a monkey and made man from a monkey. A lot of people think the mud is far superior than the monkey for some other reason, but I don't know. Many of those things about the borrowings of the Old Testament and how that all the cultures around had similar creation stories and the evidence of Israel's borrowings. If you are stuck with this idea that the real beginning of human history has to be positively nailed down and located, you'll always be in darkness and confusion. You'll never settle it. Look, wake up. Christians, wake up. Don't you believe your own affirmation of faith? The real creation, the real beginning of human history, and the real end too of human history. It all begins there at the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It all begins there. So all your thinking has to begin there. And if you begin there, everything becomes new again. And you have this whole new standpoint of looking at everything. And you'll find that just as the resurrection turned the whole religious schema of things upside down for the first Christian, I want to propose that if we begin right where we are supposed to begin, from this standpoint, this same resurrection faith is going to take our views of everything, our traditions about everything. It will take the whole gamut of the Christian religion and utterly turn it upside down. You'll have a new view of the death of Christ. You'll have a new way of reading the Old Testament and looking at it. You'll have a new freedom in your use of the Bible. You'll have a new view of sin. You'll have a whole new view of the world, a new view of missionary activity. A new view, a very, very positive view of people who are locked into the religious traditions and great world religions that somehow Christians have never been able to reach before. It's great fun to begin again, to turn everything upside down and see everything renewed in this light, and see how words and concepts and everything, why, it gives you a new aspect on life, a new view of what this mortal existence is. You see it in the new light. For me, I have to say that this new resurrection faith has given me an altogether new view of what death is, or of what we think death is. Once I used to start and get my bearings from the Old Testament, and my theology of death was based on the Old Testament. Well, it's ridiculous to go on like that. Well, we're not going to explore everything, you know, but I'm just sort of trying to tease you here about some of the possibilities. You take the meaning of words and great New Testament concepts and look at them again in the light of the resurrection. Take this one, justification. I mean, you know, the great battleground of the Reformation. They fought over that for hundreds of years. What is the meaning of justification? Now, Protestant, Orthodox Protestant theology said justification is a strictly legal word. It is purely forensic. It is wholly declaratory. So if you're a Protestant purist, when you talk about justification, you're talking about something that God declares, not something that he creatively does. You have to weed all that out of it. You have to have justification as purely a legal thing. Why, I know what I'm talking about here. I spent 10 years on this. I'm authority on this, I want you to know, on Protestant doctrine of justification. I used to be introduced to seminars. At a Lutheran seminar, they introduced me as someone who out-Lutherans the Lutherans. The Orthodox Protestant doctrine, justification is purely forensic, purely declaratory, and you weed out of everything from it that's actually, you know, sort of creative, dynamic, effective, effificare, it's in the Latin. You know, effificare, oh, you avoid that word. That's Roman Catholic, you know, and you flee from that one. Because, you see, in the 16th century, the doctrine of the atonement was all legal. The explanations of the death of Christ were all legal, in spite of the fact that Paul says this great righteousness of God is entirely outside the categories of law. The Christian church ignores that and tries to explain the great mystery of the cross of Christ in terms of law, and it's really only a projection of human laws and human institutions, and human evil too, if you please. And because the cross and everything about Christianity is on a legal framework, a legal basis, then the argument between the Catholics and the Reformers, it begins on this presupposition of the legal basis and the legal framework. And in one sense, according to the ground rules of the debate, I admit the Protestants were right in that they more correctly preserved the freeness of God's grace and so on. But if you come back to the resurrection and say, what does justification mean in the light of the resurrection? Look, I want to show you how simple it is. Don't think this is hard. You say, I'm not a linguist. How can I understand etymology? How can I get my head onto those great big fat theological dictionaries and read 40 pages of fine print on the meaning of justification? I'll be more confused at the end of it than I was at the beginning of it. Now I want to say there's an easier way. If you want justification defined, what is justification? What's the cue? What is the revelatory act? What is going to explain the meaning of justification to you? Suppose you look at it in the light of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. You see, God is such a one. He executes justice on behalf of all the oppressed. He executes justice on behalf of all that are oppressed. Now, if ever there was an oppressed man and a misunderstood man, it was this Jesus, right? Look at him. Condemned, spat on, put out of the city with the godless, sent out to hell because outside the city was Gehenna, sent him off to hell. He's nothing better than a pretend Messiah. He goes out and he's executed with all the refuse. Condemned, cast out, right? You got the picture? That's what human evaluation was of this Jesus. They judged him, and see how they judged him. That was a Friday, but the old Negro, as he kept saying in his great sermon, it's Friday, but Sundays are coming. On the crack of dawn on Sunday morning, the great court sits and God gives his verdict, and what does he do? Whereas Jesus is condemned by human tribunals and by human action, God justifies Jesus. How does he do it? Does he sit up there in heaven and say, well, we'll make a declaratory verdict that he's been greatly misunderstood? Our heavenly court makes a purely forensic verdict that he's vindicated. And then the disciples get the marvellous message somehow from heaven, I don't know how they'd get it, that actually in the view of heaven, Jesus is not condemned at all. He's actually justified, but he's justified only by a declaratory act. Now, of course, it's nonsense. God justifies Jesus. How does he do it? Come on. He justifies his son by raising him from the dead. Now, that's not purely declaratory. That's a mighty energy, the mighty working of God and raising him from the dead. That's what justification is. So on that point, I have to give the point to the Roman Catholics and not to the Protestants. Of course. Of course, the whole debate of the 16th century was out of the category of the ballpark of the New Testament anyway. They weren't disputing it in the light of the resurrection. They were only disputing it in the light of their own framework of Latin thinking, of Latin theology, and of the human law court. And it was never settled effectively. Now we override the whole lot of, wipe it out, the whole arguments of justification, not to be put in that context. We go right back there to the New Testament in the light of the resurrection, and it defines forever. Even though you don't know anything about language, you can say, I can see how God has justified his son by raising him up from the dead, and as I participate in that event with him, of course, and raised with him and all the rest of it, you can go on and see what your justification is. But that'll give you a wholly new way, a wholly new standpoint on looking at justification. But generally we don't do things that way. You take the New Testament words, and I can only mention this briefly. I don't care, we take the great words that come through the New Testament like covenant and reconciliation and propitiation and sacrifice. There's another, the word sacrifice. Do you know what we've done as Christians? We go the way, it's represented by the great classical dictionaries of theology. You take, for instance, Kittel's great German dictionary translated in English. I don't know how many volumes. I got the whole library about that. You know, you couldn't even put your two arms around the volumes. The great dictionary of New Testament words, and you look up the meaning of the word justification, you look up the meaning of the word atonement or reconciliation, whatever it is. And you know where it all starts? They start back at etymology, and then they go through carefully about the Old Testament meaning. You first of all are schooled in the Old Testament meaning of the word. And then after you've grasped the Old Testament meaning of the word, then you come to the New Testament and say, now I know what the word means. And what happens, and this is what we fail to get hold of, the New Testament often takes words and gives them, it turns them on their head and gives them an entirely different meaning. And there's a big surprise there, like the surprise of Jesus' parables, as Jesus loved to tell jokes and turn everything upside down and break through conventional meanings of what is right and wrong and so on. He turns everything upside down, and that is what the New Testament frequently does. The resurrection takes great Old Testament things like sacrifice and atonement and justification, and very often there are many things in the New Testament wherein the concept, the whole view is turned completely on its head, because the Old Testament is the type, isn't it? Right? And the New Testament is the antitype. Now, type and antitype relationship is not a one-to-one. This is the model, and if that you see, understand the model, the reality has to happen like the model, but the reality is called antitype. And what does anti mean? It means completely the other way around. So the book of Hebrews says this is how it was in the type, and the antitype, the reality, is completely different. Again and again, it's shown that the antitype is not at all like the type. What a disaster then. What a disaster, what a mistake, is to go back, and this is how we have thought, and there's a lot of theology on this, especially since World War II, of going back to the Old Testament, of talking about the authority of the Old Testament. We go back to the Old Testament, and what we do, we try and get our bearings and our directions and our definitive understanding from the Old Testament. It is like going into the darkness and the chaos of Genesis 1 before there was any light and try and get a compass reading. That's about how accurate it can be. And therefore, in Jesus Christ, resurrected from the dead, God has made everything new. He has given us a totally new way of looking at everything. Thank you.